Today we're going to start our fourth unit or lecture about economics, and we're going to explore the concept of scarcity, and this will conclude kind of our basic introduction to the building blocks of economics. Now, the concept of scarcity is often associated with the economist Thomas Malthus, who wrote a book called Essays on Population in 1798 that explored the relationship between population and the food supply. And we'll be exploring it in Malthus's context, particularly in relation to demographics and population. But we're also going to look at this concept of scarcity, at least in two other lights. The first one is this savings. And you could say this is a scarcity or the glut of money, and how that affects, let's say, the balance between the present and the future in terms of, let's say, the money problem that we discussed in the last unit. And a little more lightheartedly, we're going to discuss the sex ratio, which is, you could say, the relative scarcity of men to women or women to men, depending on the situation. The sex ratio measures kind of basically how many women there are versus how many men are in society. In traditional societies, there tends to be more men than women. In modern societies, you tend to get more women than men, and what that implies for how society is run. And this is a little bit connected both to the savings, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but also to the dynamics of population itself. So all these three things are going to tie together by the end. But I want to begin with a cartoon, because I think one country really exemplifies this idea of scarcity. And here we have a cartoon, obviously about India, 50 years from independence. So this would come out in the late 80s, early 90s. And what you can see is that India has been a democracy for 50 years, but economically, it's been pretty much plagued with chronic hunger, and you can see the little drop out of all that independence really isn't feeding the feeding bowl, and India still, to this day, struggles with hunger and starvation as a current issue. Well, this was also kind of Malthus, writing in 1798, the problem that he was facing. So let me take you back to about 1800 England and explain the problem that Malthus was trying to explain. By 1800, the Industrial Revolution was fairly apparent, or it was clear that England was quickly becoming the richest country in Europe, and soon would be one of the richest countries, most powerful countries in the world, and that was all well and good. But there was another very disturbing trend that Malthus and many others had noticed, which was that there seemed to be an increase in the amount of poor people. Now, this seemed to be a bit of a contradiction. How could your country be getting richer at the same time there was more poverty? And so Malthus tried to understand how could you reconcile this idea of increased poverty with a growing economy. And so he tried to look at it in several different lights. And his explanation basically centered on this idea of England's population relative to his resources. So Thomas Malthus, this early economist, basically said that a growing economy meant that people would live longer, they would have better health, they would have better nutrition, at least in the short term, and this would lead to population growth. But the population would grow a lot faster than the food supply of the country. Now, England was a relatively small country in 1800 and relatively self-sufficient. There were tariffs basically forcing people to eat English food, meaning that it wasn't really efficient to import food from France or the United States or other places where food could be produced cheaper. And as a result, eventually the population would put too much pressures on the resource base and the food supply that England could provide. Because even though more people might grow more food, okay, they wouldn't grow enough food to, let's say, maintain themselves. So if you remember the example from the previous week where I talked about that kind of, let's say, that pizza. If the pizza isn't growing, or the pizza is not growing as fast as the number of people who are eating it, everyone's slice is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually most people are starving because their slice is too small to support them. So, though it takes a little more, I think, to understand what Malthus was saying. So here we have a chart showing kind of, let's say, the population and food and what would happen over time according to Malthus. Now, the first element here is to look at food production. And food production, and this is generally agreed upon, shows decreasing returns to scale. So, for example, at first you would use the best land. If you're growing food, you would use the best land, you would use fertilizers, irrigation, etc., and you might get, let's say, a pretty, big increase in food production. But the problem is, once you've used all the good land and you've used the first dose of fertilizers and you've provided the first level of irrigation, you're probably not going to be able to get that same increase in the future, because all that's left is, let's say, the marginal land that doesn't grow as much or doesn't have as much nutrients in the ground. If you keep putting more fertilizer in the ground, it's not going to have the same impact as that first, let's say, dose of fertilizer. And if you know anything about irrigation, the more irrigation you have, the more water you have out, the more saline or the more salt that's going to build up in these irrigation canals, and eventually that's going to kill the soil's ability to support food. So what's going to happen over time as you try to, let's say, increase the food supply, you're going to kind of hit a ceiling. And that's why this graph kind of levels off over time. Yes, you might have some inventions, you might have, let's say, new technology or growing technique, but you're going to get a big boost up front, and eventually, though, that boost is going to level off. You're going to have decreasing returns of scale. Well, what about population? Well, population is probably going to be an exponential curve, which means that, think of rabbits. Okay, generation 1, you might have 2 rabbits. Those 2 rabbits in the next generation have 4 rabbits. The next generation might have 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, okay, and onward and onward and onward until you have, let's say, the people are going to double and double and double each generation unless there's something to limit that population growth. So eventually there's going to be, let's say, a lot of momentum in the growth of population. And it might start relatively small, right? 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16. But eventually that's going to have, let's say, geometric or exponential characteristics. The population is going to grow out of control. And this means that we're on kind of, let's say, on a crash course where the food production is going here as the green line is flattening off, and just as population growth is starting to pick up. And what's going to happen at some point in the future, the population is going to be much larger than the ability of the Earth to provide the food for that population. And what's going to happen is that people are going to starve, and eventually they're going to have a famine, and a lot of people are going to die. And so this was what Malthus was trying to say was happening in England. As England was becoming richer, not by growing food, but actually by making manufactured things and selling them abroad, its population was getting richer and able to grow. People were living longer, healthier, etc. But the problem was more people are going to be poor because there's not going to be as much food. And so what you were seeing kind of, let's say, from the bottom on up is an increase in the poverty of, let's say, average citizens in England. So the capitalists at the top of English society might still be doing relatively well, but little by little the population pressures on the food supply were eating away at the welfare of the bottom of English society. So what Malthus has discovered is this idea of scarcity. And in short, scarcity means that there's never enough of something to satisfy everyone's demand. And if you want to just think of this in terms of mathematical relationships, the demand is greater than the supply. The demand for food, i.e. the food that will provide a healthy living for everyone, is greater than the Earth's ability to supply that food. And that's a scarcity of food. There's not enough food to feed everyone, and to, let's say, give everyone the adequate number of calories to maintain a healthy lifestyle. And in fact, this is actually true for most of human history. At the beginning of the last lecture, we talked about the Malthusian trap, which means that for most of human history, people were undernourished. People did not get enough calories. And that kind of put, let's say, a ceiling or a limit on the ability of the population of the Earth to grow. And if the population did grow, eventually what it meant is that people's incomes or standard of livings would go down. Now, scarce is not the same thing as valuable, even though a scarce resource might increase in price. So let me just compare two things to kind of illustrate this idea of scarcity. So let's something that relatively has a high price like diamonds, but not particularly high intrinsic value. So this is an idea of the price is being driven by its scarcity. Now, diamonds are not really scarce, as anyone who's seen the movie Blood Diamonds knows. There are relatively few diamond mining companies in the world, and they have a lot of diamonds, but they actually don't put them onto the market because if they did put them onto the market, the value of diamonds would go down, and they wouldn't be able to make as much money on the diamonds that they were selling. But basically, it is scarce. There's only so many diamonds in the world. This is one reason why you can buy jewelry or diamonds that can cost $2,000 or $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 or more. But diamonds, I mean, they do have some manufacturing applications, but basically they're low intrinsic values. They're basically just shiny rocks. And so there's really no value reason, in the sense of value meaning value to human life, improving our the way that we live, to diamonds that would justify the high prices that we put on them. Compare that with something like air, the air that you breathe, oxygen, things of that sort. This is a very high intrinsic value. It's absolutely necessary for us to have air to live. But it's relatively plentiful, right? You wouldn't buy air in a mason jar, right? Because you could always just breathe air, go outside in most places in the United States, breathe in and you have air. So the price is relatively low. It's basically zero. You might say that people actually pay for the quality of air, and probably the best way to see this is Los Angeles, where the clean air that's on the top of the hills and canyons are relatively high priced, and the low priced areas are the areas in south central LA where you have the highest level of smog descending down on the city. And you could say that the price of air is built into the price of real estate, but for all intents and purposes there's not really an air market or oxygen market unless you're, let's say, diving and you're going to a place where air would be scarce. So high price here, that price is not actually telling us a lot about value. There is something about scarcity that will also have an effect on price. Now, let's get back to Malthus for a second. Basically what he said is that our productivity, or our ability to produce more food would increase slower than population. It wouldn't necessarily stop. It wouldn't necessarily hit, let's say, a wall and there's only so much food the earth can produce, but if it increased slower than population, eventually population would catch up. This would lead to a famine, and the faster the economy grew, the faster the population would grow. The faster the population grew, the faster you would get to this population bomb or food deficit sometime in the near future. So what did Malthus propose we do about this? How can we keep population under control? How can we forestall this kind of oncoming crisis? Well, Malthus basically said we should keep people's wages low. Right, we could pay them more, they might be more valuable, but we don't want to give people too much money. And this is an idea that's called starvation wages. You need to obviously pay people enough to feed themselves, right? If they don't get enough money, they're not going to come to the factory and work 18 hours for you. So you're going to pay them just enough to stay alive, but no more. And what this means is that they wouldn't have any extra money to raise children. They wouldn't have any extra money to, let's say, consume more resources. They would basically subsist on the minimum that you could. Any wages above starvation wages, even if those wages were, let's say, relative to their skills or their labor in the market, you should keep them artificially low. Because any excess in wages for, let's say, the bottom society is just going to encourage them, A, to have more children, but B, also maybe to live more affluent lifestyles. And if you feed the hungry, he would say, if someone can't provide for himself, if someone can't find useful labor and actually earn an income on what they were working on, then we probably should just let them die.